computer. I'll do that.
Good. Well, welcome all of you inside the room and virtually as well. So this is a talk on his new book, City of Desire by Tanzil, who's been a member of this community for many years and is now in England. So a bit about the book. So City of Desire is a portrait of the largest informal settlement in Bangladesh. It's in Dhaka. It seeks to develop a Southern perspective on urban slums, challenging mainstream Western discourses, in other words, what the rest of us are doing. Tanzil's approach is rooted in personal and thematic exploration, and he proposes new ways of understanding their struggles and aspirations. What I've noticed about Tanzil, because I was his co-supervisor, and we had many great conversations with Kim and three of us, and is that he always really kind of grounded his work in the social reality, which was very striking and positive. So he's now a lecturer of urban design at the University of Sheffield, and he did teach here, and before that he taught at the University of Arkansas, which is probably not a good place to go anymore. I don't know. And so his interests are Southern urbanism, pluriversal architectural practice, and informal planning, in particular by climate change impacted communities. And he co-convenes the Platform for Just Housing and the justURBAN think tank, working towards climate justice with local activists and citizens. Tanzil, welcome, and over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I missed the all the nice details of the Japanese room, which I can only see now, but I can recollect from my memory being there. So it's good to be, I have been presenting this book, in many universities now, and it's interesting in the sense that I think this is one of the last talk that I'm doing on this, and it's back at Melbourne where large part of this is crafted. So I'll just get on straight with it. Just do let me know if the slides are working.
Slides are working.
Yeah.
They're up now.
Okay. So yes, so the City of Desire is published from Bloomsbury, London, end of 2024, so freshly out in 2025. As David was mentioning this, I mean, I think let me do justice to what he said by actually trying to ground every one of you in from which reality the book is written. I think it might be a bit choppy. I don't know if it's choppy, but David, can you confirm that the video is moving, even if it's choppy?
The video is moving. It's a little bit choppy, but it still looks good.
Okay, I mean, it's still, as long as it's moving along, even if it's a stutter. So the settlement that you see, that's Karail, right in the middle of Dhaka City, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But the starting point for this book is when I was doing my undergrad in Dhaka, my house and my university was literally across this settlement. Like I had to go through this. I had to go through this settlement for 5 years in my undergrad, and the things that I was being told in my architecture school were this idea that this is all like criminal activities going on. It should be raised to the ground where architects can go and design a lot of new housing buildings and really smart cities and stuff. It didn't really match with the reality that I saw every day for 5 years. So when I had the opportunity to actually do a PhD, you know, I went sort of like back at that question of, how did this place operate? How did this urban design happen? How did the governance happen? So all of these questions were sort of like the root out of which this is coming from. So, going back, I started going through this element in 2007. So that's pretty much an 18-year stretch. The book is sort of like written after this 18 years of experience in many different capacities. I'll start with a few disclaimers. So it's it's interesting because now I'm saying this back in Melbourne. So this is my PhD committee meeting to, after I come back from field work and I submit this. I submit somewhat of a manuscript. I write 11 short stories about my experiences that, traverse through different aspects. And then this is this is not acceptable really as a dissertation. So I'm not going to name names, but I mean, there were committee members who said, this is not acceptable as PhD. Publish it later, but now go and write academically, as in really write to a particular discipline, which I did. So for my PhD dissertation, which now sits, in your online repository, it's not the book. So when I moved to England, I know I totally not did not have time to do this, but 2023 I said, I really need to get back to that manuscript and get back to that the stories, non-fiction stories that I wrote. So this is not the dissertation. And it's an important um, point of departure for me. So the reality that I'm talking of is in Dhaka, but across all the different talks that I've given, um, people have said that the stories resonate them across, Johannesburg, across Mumbai, and Cape Town, and so this is not really about trying to theorize all slums slash informal settlements. And of course, we make the distinction that I'm interested in the informal settlement, the informal production, and not the particular lack of stuff that makes a place into a slum. Just as a reminder, we are right now you know, uh, in South Asia, in Bangladesh, at the center of sort of like geography center is the capital city, and you can see, the built form of that capital city, and Karail. The settlement is right sits at this almost at the heart of it. And just to give a context, around the neighborhoods around, you can see, the peninsula-like structure, the peninsula-like form that you see on the east here. Uh, this is the most expensive part in Dhaka called Gulshan, and this neighborhood is just to give a sense of it. The central avenue here, the per square feet rent is more than or all equal to Fifth Avenue in New York. So you can just give a sense of where Coral is, and it's an unlikely piece of real estate that it occupies. So if you were to zoom in more, and then you start seeing sort of like in an absolute, this ultra density of built forms, but also you start seeing that large chunks of land is occupied by government agencies. So that BTCL is the Telecommunication Limited. So they hold a lot of land around, and surrounded by uh, formal neighborhoods, primarily formal neighborhoods all around. Um, in particular, I looked at, and I hope this one is also working, so you can slowly see the transformation. So this is the western edge of Karail, and I'm looking, primarily in my PhD, I looked at the urban morphogenesis, the transformation of the urban form, and sort of like the other underlying desires, the conditions, and the configurations that allowed this particular morphology to appear. So, that's 2014, and you can clearly see what's going on. So, fast forward, this is 2024, and you clearly see that people in Caral are particularly inspired by Venice. So, you can see that it's pretty much now a canal. So, um, there are a few points of departure before I go into sort of like the content of the book. And the way that I pitch the book is, I take one story from each of the chapters. But maybe it's worthwhile to mention some of the sort of like theoretical departures before we move into the book. So, but as you see, I mean, the book is structured primarily into these 11 short stories. And then if you start seeing the names of the chapters, they're not really written in a way to sort of like specifically talk about particular aspects. at least from the surface of it. But in terms of the way that the book is packaged, so all of the references and sort of like all the theoretical baggage is somewhat taken to the end notes. So it's all packed into the end notes, and the book reads as a set of stories, but there is sort of like a theoretical underpinning behind that. And sort of like the central theoretical underpinning behind the book is this notion of assemblage thinking and the way that, assemblages operate through sets of desires. And then, desire becomes this analytic, an overarching analytic across all of these stories of this multiplicities of desire. I was very lucky to get Abdul Malik Simon to write the foreword for the book, and in the foreword he mentions, you know, he sort of like picks up on this thread of desire as as the central thematic of the book. Um, and before I sort of also move on to the stories, another point, sort of like a theoretical point of departure, is one of the reviewers came back when they looked at the full book, and then he said, you write in English, but you don't write in English." Now, I didn't know how to take this. I mean, but I was glad that it was picked up because the stories are written. So, and this is where this notion of a southern sort of like, trying to move away from, because, each sort of like discursive space has a particular tonality to it. So when I'm writing the stories, I'm writing in a way that sits much more comfortably within the way that I would have talked about the place to the people there. So that the sense, the sort of like the logic of the sense of the book is coming from that particular place rather than writing to a very particular, English speaking academic discipline. For me, this is an important this is a literary experiment because primarily I'm not writing in Bangla, which is the native tongue there. I'm not writing in Bangla. I am writing in English, but I am sort of employing English, in and then sort of like forming it into that tone, which is why that was picked up. But I mean, that's I would say like one of the key features of the book is that. But again, the important thing are the stories themselves, right? So, and then I'll just quickly go through these some of these like key stories to sort of entice you to read the whole book. So one of the way that the book starts, the chapter with which it starts is called "Another Hole in the Wall." And what is this about? So if you recollect the government agency which sits north of the settlement, in 2013, uh, this government agency is not a powerful one. They don't have the power to really evict the quote unquote slum dwellers. They don't have the power to really do anything much more nefarious. What is in their power is actually they say we don't, the control of the gaze. So they say we don't want to see these people as we go to the office. So literally they built 1 kilometer long wall, that protects sort of like their road into their compound, into their compound. And and then what I explore is as this wall is built, you can see the same wall sort of like in the bottom picture where you see the transformation that has happened, and then how the wall is sort of engulfed. And but for me, the interesting thing was when the wall was built, all this informal planning that went on about leaving particular segments of the wall unbuilt. And this unbuilt is produced, informally when the contractors are working there. There is all this informal negotiations going on. People, bribing them. Some of the contractors doing it out of care that they know that there is a settlement behind it. They know that you need access. So all of this, both negotiated and done for care, ends up having this perforations along that entire wall. And now, not all perforations were done in a planned way. So, for example, I know coming from an architecture background and sort of like mapping the particular very very particular urban morphological details, I sort of mapped the wall along it, and then I mapped the wall thickness. Interestingly, the entire wall is really done at a bare minimum by the contractor, which is a 5-inch brick wall. In a very particular spot, the wall suddenly is quite thickened. It's like 10 inches, and you can pretty much see that the thickened wall there. And what was the story behind it? As it happens in 2013, there is a fire in the settlement, and then the shop owner who is next to that wall, he actually broke the wall to allow people to sort of like have a safe passage into an open area for fire assembly. And after the fire, the government agency BTCL comes, they investigate who broke the wall, and this is surprising to me because the level at which the government agency has gone to sort of like, build back that particular bit of wall, trying to reinforce it and sort of like trying to teach a lesson. And, this almost like a granular, lived reality of a settlement, of a, relationship between the state apparatus and the everyday life of the settlement. Uh, this is not how you talk about state when you're talking about sort of like policy implementations or lack of policy and all that. So this was, and then when I was asking this guy like, what are you gonna do if there is a fire again? And he's like, he pointed to the next bit and he said, we'll just break the next bit. Yeah. So but now, when I say, some state can operate at that, granular level, but states do operate in Bangladesh, and then I talk about this in the chapter. This is a settlement which is 2 kilometers from Karail. This is in 2019. When I'm doing my field work, this settlement, I get a call, I rush over there, but it takes about 3 hours. Within that time, this is completely, broken down and using bulldozers and magistrates, let's say. So, the full force of the legal entity of the state, comes to fruition. And then by the time I go there, you may see this as sort of like a pitiful existence, and, but you can start seeing how the materials are being organized. You can see in the foreground someone trying to sort of, bring all the bamboos that can be used. They're already sorting materials because these people, they need to figure out where they're going to build uh, by tonight, at some level, because of course this land needs to be cleared. But some of them have already planned ahead in the sense that they knew this day was coming. So they have sort of solicited elsewhere potential places where they're going to move the materials that can be moved. And so there is, of course, uh, uh, that idea of planning a resettlement by themselves already embedded in this picture that apparently is not seen. So this idea of coming together as a community to do citizen-led initiatives, if you can say it in that way, is quite particular against the state. Now, the second chapter moves on to sort of this notion, because I kept reading in the literature all this talk about the community, and everyone used the term as a sort of a homogeneous entity, and that was not my experience. I don't have a picture for this, which is why, do not read it. I'm going to tell the story, but it's a placeholder. So the story for why the community does not exist is a story that starts with me, going to before the field work. There was a national election day. I'm in Bangladesh. I'm in Dhaka, so I'm like, I'm going to exercise my right to vote. I go to the local voting station, which happens to be in a school right next to Korail. And then as I approach, there are 50 or 100 angry young men with sticks and stuff, and it's clearly rigging the election for some party. So they sort of like anyone they don't know, they chase away. So they don't know me, so I'm being chased away. As I'm chased away, I get the best interview without even asking. The rickshaw puller, so I'm on this tri-wheeler rickshaw. I'm being pulled away, and the rickshaw puller is telling me all this information about how this is organized, how young men from the settlement are sort of given a one-day job, and then how it's orchestrated by some local leaders and all of that. Fast forward 1 month, I'm actually starting my field work. I go to a community meeting, the community leaders are there, and the community leaders, one of the community leaders is very articulate. He talks about, he doesn't allow me to talk. He says, let me explain your project to them. He explains the project, that I'm going to map and I'm going to do all of this and why research is important. He talks about women empowerment. He talks about SDG goals and stuff like that. And then when I get to know him and I get to know his name, this is the same guy who was behind all that election rigging and sort of like robbing my power to vote, is also the same guy who is leading the community. And the point being made here is all this absolutely contrasting roles that are being taken up and being played, that you would not assume at all. What this means is, and this is operating at a very granular scale again. So, even that 500 meter by 500 meter, the western side, which I was studying in particular, even within that, you can see these different territories. So this map sort of like shows different territories under different local leaders. And sometimes the thickness of the line is actually how strongly that territory is sort of maintained. So you can see some lines are sort of like really weak, which is the territory is not yet finalized, it's being negotiated or is being carved up, which means that it's almost like a polynucleated way of, so there is no central authority, there is no centralized committee. There are loose formations, loose connections, which sometimes assemble for particular purposes. But other than that, these leaders, these territories often are quite heterogeneous. So that's sort of like, this chapter talks about the community. But as I've talked about the state and the people, one thing I have not mentioned, which is absolutely vital in the way that Carlisle operates and a lot of the settlements operate, is their silent partner. Um, then the silent partner are NGOs or non-government organizations. And I started the story with this. In when I'm giving this lecture in UK, it's actually much more relatable because what you see in the picture is a toilet that is built by WaterAid UK. So WaterAid, and I tell people here that your tax money is actually being used to, let's say, build this toilet. So this toilet is built by WaterAid UK, but actually it's, they transfer the money to WaterAid Bangladesh. WaterAid Bangladesh then transfers the money to another local NGO. Another local NGO then transfers the money to the local community uh, organization, and they hire contractors to build it. Now, the story about this toilet, for example, is the way that after the NGO comes and then the NGO, they know all about participation. They know all about, uh, they have like a checklist of how to do things in a participatory way. So they, bring the community on board. They bring together everyone. They select the site together. All of that happens. And then after 6 months, you come and give a report. It's a communal toilet working great, but after 1 year, you start seeing that site where the toilet. This is a communal public toilet where it's built is actually conveniently right next to one of the local leaders' house. And then after, a few months, you start seeing his house sort of like engulfing the toilet. So in this particular instance, for example, not only did it engulf it at one horizontal level, he actually built on top of the toilet. And so what was like a communal toilet ended up being a private toilet in his housing compound. And now this is a very literal way where NGOs are facilitating sort of urban transformation, in a very physical sense, in a very direct sense. In the book, I do talk about the financialization that has happened through microcredit programs. So in particular, NGOs like BRAC, which is what the world's largest NGO, right now they have, I forget the figure, but something like $47 million invested in Carlisle through microcredit programs. And the funny thing is, those microcredit programs are not actually for housing loans. They're given for business and livelihoods. So people know how to game the system. So, they often would send, in collusion with their family, they will send the wife because they know that women entrepreneurs are more likely to get the loan. They would propose a shop, get the loan, but actually then build their house, build the second story, or do an extension of the house, rent it out, and then pay back. So a lot of the urban production that has happened is actually financed by these microgrid programs. But on paper, this is not nowhere to be mentioned. The fourth chapter talks about this notion of events and particularly disasters and how events and disaster end up shaping sort of like the narrative of the settlement and how that ends up impacting the way it's actually built and rebuilt. So this is a plan from a local architectural agency which does pro bono work. So there was a fire in 2017, and then this architecture agency comes and they say, we will do the replanning in a fire safety in a way that is safe during if there is any fire event, and then they plan again. They know this was done again in consultation, in participation with the local residents, all the local landholders, the local everyone coming together and proposing the plan. The black box that you see, the dotted black box, is the only bit that is actually built according to the plan. The rest of it, even if it started in this way, the rest of it is built back exactly how it was before the fire. And that goes to sort of, that in this chapter, I talk about this idea that, how, events that is sort of like managed in a as an after the fact. Oftentimes the urban production is going to go back to the way that it was, because that surface level participation didn't really change the particular narrative of how people saw their houses, how people negotiated tenure. It didn't really, it was only at a very surface level. As opposed to that, in the northern neighborhood in Coral, where there was never any fire, but there was a huge the self-widening program happening. So the street that you see or the alley that you see was half the size it was. And then in this entire segment where there are like 5,000 houses, there was a self-organized, spontaneous, self-widening program following a big fire in 2018. And even though this part was not touched by the fire, the fire happened in the south of the settlement, people here had enough social capital sort of like to hear of this narrative of the fire and the way that it actually spread in the settlement. They could capitalize on the way the fire was being talked about. As the narrative started shifting, the community came together. So the NGOs which tried to do this self-widening program for a long time through rational communicative planning were not able to do this at all in 8 years, they did it in very selective places. As opposed to when this really happened, people voluntarily gave away, the front bit of their houses, and then sort of receded their houses to let the self-widening, to go through. So in this chapter, I talk about this idea of how events shape narratives and how narratives end up shaping large-scale decision making. If anyone is interested to see the role of narratives in I suggest the book called Narrative Economics by Peter Schiff, I think. The book then slowly moves on to sort of really the rudimentary elements of the housing, the streets, very ordinary urban elements. But before I go to the ordinary urban elements in the book, I say that there is a social imperative that comes long before a house is built. So long before the spatial material manifestation, there is a social imperative that is required. An example the story to start with is this is a local social/political club. And you can see the way that the image of the local councillor is plastered on the wall, the value of images. People in Karail, roughly the ratio of renters versus landholders, and I don't use the word landlord, I use landholder because this is still government land and people are holding the land in a precarious way. So roughly the ratio is 20 to 80. So you have 20% landholders and 80% renters. The average time that it takes for a renter to become a landholder is about 5 years. In the same way that you need to have a solid credit rating if you want to buy a house with a mortgage, similar to that, before local leaders sort of allow you to build on the edge of the lake or allow you to sort of like build the second story of your house, they will do sort of like a social check of how you have been. So it takes around 5 years to sort of like volunteer with the local leaders, to be part, to be seen with them. So oftentimes people will loiter or hang around this social political club. If they can get access inside, they will try to take a picture with the local leaders. Then they will use those pictures and selfies. For example, a selfie with a local leader, they will use it to weave these stories that I'm so close to the local leader. See, I know I'm you know see I was in his office, he was talking with me, I took a selfie. And then that becomes a legitimizing process for him to start building at the edge of the lake, as compared to other people who don't have the acumen to actually get that social legitimacy. Interestingly, this is how it's all the way up the chain. So the local councillor then does it with the mayor does it with the minister does it with the prime minister. If you follow Bangladeshi politics, the picture of the prime minister that you see on the wall, she actually fled to India. The fascist regime fell in last year. So right now, I mean, all these pictures are taken down. But this is the story of how the social imperative is crucial even before the first brick is laid on the ground. And this idea of the social aspects of housing, another story is about how in one particular area, uh, 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 some of the local leaders came up with this idea of giving nameplates and address plates. These address plates are absolutely not from the city council. They are not legal, formal in any way. But within the context of the settlement, people whose houses had these number plates and nameplates and sort of address plates on the front of their house were qualitatively in a much better house, even if materially the houses were same, with a house that didn't have the nameplate. This sort of like this almost like if you follow like a Peter Bourdieu's, this Bourdieuan frame of an like an illusio, it's like an illusion, but everyone did buy into this illusion that, oh, if your house has that, you have dignity, you have much more legitimacy in the neighborhood, your house seems more legit. And people really was proud of it when they're showing me the nameplate and the number plate. But again, this chapter really goes into stories about dignity as a crucial currency that people are after. Now you saw the lake being transformed, and you may wonder what is the lake, how is it being transformed? And as the title suggests, it is a load of rubbish. Um, the way that this investigation, quite coincidental. One day I'm going to Coral, I'm in the formal city, walking, and then I see this rickshaw van, being used to transport lots of bags of something. And I ask, where is this going? And they say, we're just going, into Coral. And then I follow them, and I go, it goes to the lake of, the edge of the lake, and then they're dumping all this material. That material is actually construction debris from the formal city. So as the formal city is being sort of, torn down to build higher apartments, condominiums, all those construction debris, there is not a formal waste management system for construction material, and that all that construction debris is actually informal waste management done by many of them living actually in Coral. So they sort of like get paid to take it away, and in Coral they actually sell it as a way to fill up the lake. So literally, this idea of somewhat of a twist of a creative destruction in play. And you can see sort of like how the lake edge is built. You can see there that someone has the money to fill in the lake, but not the money to build the house. And he just laid out, his house plan with one layer of brick, and then, it's left like that, and that becoming an informal public space. And we'll talk about public space when we get there. And then moves on to the notion of house. And this chapter is about house/housing from a very lived reality. So this is, and it's called the desire for six arms, because six arms is basically in Bangla, it's uh, choi hat. Choi hat is literally the size of one side of a room. So people often talk about that what they need in the settlement is just 6 arms. What they need in the city is just a place that is 6 arms by 6 arms, roughly 3 meters by 3 meters. If you were to look into a 3 meter by 3 meter, house, so essentially this is the unit. That's this is a single room dwelling unit. A family of four might be living here, um, and then this is being repeated in the in forming housing compounds slash clusters, which is then being repeated to form sort of like the neighborhoods. And you might notice large canisters, the large drums. This is for storing water. Um, and then you start seeing that how the water infrastructure impacts the living space. The in Karail, water comes in most places. It's in a rationing system. So this is all informal water distribution service. You get 5 minutes of water a day. In 5 minutes, you have to hold as much water as you can in those 5 minutes. So people end up having this, large storage devices as part of as features of their house. Um, I talk about, but maybe what you don't see, actually, people, you know, in the picture, you don't see the people, and there's a particular point I'm trying to make. Even though people keep saying that all they need is a one tiny apartment, if they keep saying that all they need is one room, that's not how they live their life in Karail. Most of their day, the day life, if they're home and not working, is actually spent in communal spaces like these. So, the corridors, the courtyards, a lot of the activities, the everyday, household activities is done in in it's sort of like a commons. So this common public spaces, and which is not really open to public because there is a gate at the end of this corridor, but they're open to the people in the housing cluster. A lot of these things are done in that in that communal space. But if you were to go and do a survey, they do not say that is their demand. So there is a clear disjunction in the way that they talk about their desire and the way that they actually live. Uh, and when pressed, of course, they will say that yes, that's necessary, which is the point that I try to make in the book, is this notion that what people say is their need is often a desire that is embedded in a certain assemblage of things. So when they say that yes, they need a room which is like 3 meter by 3 meter, they actually also mean that it needs to come with this communal infrastructure, but which is what they do not verbalize. So often that gets, clearly not mentioned in housing surveys, needs assessments, need analysis, and all that. So, again, this is a chapter about housing and houses in its many shapes. Then I talk about streets. So in Corral, you might find alleys and laneways that go all the way from there to like one person can fit to a lot which is quite wide. You can see a rickshaw passing. One entry point for me into this chapter is to ask the audience actually, um, why do you think the size of the US shuttle to the moon is the size that it is? Um, and it's actually because they had to transport the hull uh, using a truck all the way to Houston, and they had to cross a few tunnels. So the size was actually dictated by the size of the smallest tunnel in that logistics. The reason that I say that, the northern part of Karail happened to be where a lot of these rickshaws were stored. Now, just for context, rickshaws are informal in Dhaka. So, the city planners never really planned for rickshaw storage or depot, or so, you'd have like large scale bus depots, but you never have a rickshaw depot. So the rickshaws eventually end up, at night in settlements like Karail, where, oftentimes that's the first function. You fill up the land, you don't need to build housing, so use it just as a parking. So these rickshaw garages, where there were these rickshaw garages, you had to ensure that a rickshaw was fitting through. So a lot of these neighborhoods where there was a rickshaw garage at the end of an alley, the alley was determined by the width of a rickshaw and a person actually walking next to him. And even when even when the settlement transformed into housing, and then rickshaw garages were later converted to housing and built, that original street morphology and that street pattern actually held, and people actually saw that there are some benefits of being, and able to take a mode of transport all the way back, to their house. And so this was, quite coincidental. So again, this sort of like social factors that end up shaping spatial dimensions and, material conditions. This is sort of like the theme explored in this chapter. And we're getting there in three more left. Um, 50 Shades of Publicness. So oftentimes when we talk about public space in informal settlements, of course, a lot of it's just like, oh, there is no public space. Because oftentimes we think of public spaces as large scale public plazas, parks, and sort of like uh, quite visible public spaces that is demarcated and that is formally sort of consecrated in some way. In Coral, there are two of these large scale public spaces, that is retained even after sort of this large scale expansion that has happened. These two are not encroached upon. And you start wondering how did they manage that? So the story goes, for example, in this one, you can see towards the right, yeah, that you can see a long shed. That's actually a school. So when actually, talking to the local community leaders, they said when this public space was created, as a community decision, they really talked about how to protect it. So, their planning mechanism was they knew that it's not about regulation because no one's going to listen to them. What they did is uh, they pegged the public space with institutions. So they built a school, they built a religious school on one side, they built some collectively owned shops on one side. So in a way, they surrounded it with property that was somewhat that had high social legitimacy. So it was difficult for someone in the community to say, oh, I'm going to take over the mosque space or I'm going to take over the yard of the school. So this institutionally pegging it actually is one way that they were able to sort of, hold back encroachment onto this public space. In this chapter, I do talk about all these public spaces, so this is like a field of differences of all the different types of public space. Some are, formally intended to be. So the one that I was showing you was like an Idgah field. These are formally intended, and some are not intended as public spaces. So, for example, rickshaw garages, they're not intended to be public spaces, but because during the day all the rickshaw garages are empty, those actually become places where people often would gather, especially with kids. They would often find these as informal public spaces to play. So that's the story about that. This story is very, very particular. So far, everywhere I presented, this is the story that actually is the one that gets the most hits. So let's see. Okay, holy cow. This story is about if you were to go in Karal, you walk 5 minutes, on your right, you'll find this shop, which is a sweet shop. In our culture, in Bangladeshi culture, in Bangla ethnicity culture, dairy-based sweet products, which is not good for you when consumed in large quantity, but we never listen to that regulation. This is very, very particularly important, which is why this dairy-based product. So the first day that I was visiting Coral in 2019 in my fieldwork, I had a friend who took me there, and he's like, "Oh, try this, have some." I had some, and then he said, "Where do you think the milk is coming from?" I was like, "I don't know," and then he said, "Okay, walk with me." We go in the back. In the back of their sweet shop is a shed full of cows. So there are like 35 cows in the shed. So talking about farm to table restaurants isn't just a New York, London, or a Melbourne thing. Growing microgreens in your basement with in hydroponics. This is really taken to the next level because this is an operating farm at the back of it. This chapter is about functional mix. This chapter is about synergies between different functions, different livelihoods that enable people to actually live in a way that is, that's not just quote unquote a slum where only urban poor migrants are there. It's like a city that makes it a city. I don't have a glamorous picture of the cow. The only one I don't have actually a picture of the cow in the book, but I dig one up for the lecture. It's not glamorous, so be warned. It's the backside of the cow. Yeah, it's the backside of the cow. The story doesn't end here. This is where the global meets the local. If you notice the particular breed of the cow, this is an Australian cow. So this is an Australian, Australia exports cow, semen, bull semen. So the semen is imported in Bangladesh. This cow is hybridized with the local cow, and so, and the story is Kim goes to Bangladesh in 2019 during my field work. I take Kim, and Kim is there next to the cow, and then someone says, "Oh wow, the Australian PhD supervisor next to the Australian cow." Uh, so that's when I said, "Okay, holy cow!" So that's where this chapter is coming from. Okay, so the story doesn't end there. How is this an operating farm? The farm run by the sweet shop owner, they have a deal with the local wet market, which is 5 minutes away. The feed of the cow is actually all the waste vegetables, like vegetables and all the bits of the vegetables that you don't eat, the bottom of the cauliflower, the sides of turnips and stuff like that. So all of that is actually cleaned every morning and then brought so the the cow owners, they get a lot of feed free. The wet market is cleaned of all this debris, and they don't have to they're not worried about their biological waste. All of that is getting cleaned. So this is sort of like a multi-factor, a multi-species interchange, that a functional mix that enables a lot of things to thrive together. So this chapter is about that. The last chapter is about, I'm not going to say what this is about. I'll tell you the story. So there is a popular urban myth in Bangladesh, which is that this entire settlement. Uh, oh, by the way, I didn't give you the statistics because I don't know why I forgot. But this is 300,000 people living in the size of two Buckingham Palaces. I'm so used to British references. So or uh, if it's easier, 1/10 of Central Park. So that's 300,000 people, 1/10 of Central Park. Um, and then the idea is that this is a common thing. So one of the NGO chief exec, she told me this entire place, it's actually just completely controlled, held by 70 godfathers. And when I say godfathers, they mean like mafia. So they say, oh, this is entirely run by mafia. So there is this a middle class, an upper middle class, a class-based narrative of how all of this is illegal, this is run by mafia. So this criminalization that somewhat produces the consent for forced evictions. Because if you see that it's if you believe that it's run by 70 mafia, when it gets evicted, then you'd be like, yeah, our city is getting rid of the criminals. So that plays an important role. And this chapter runs counter to that urban legend or myth. The entry point for this chapter is a story in which I'm doing, interviews, and I'm, having conversations. I knock on a door, the door opens, and this is the view. I'm perplexed because, I know for sure that this is a house door because there's a nameplate on the outside. I know, and then this opens. So what's the story here? This house had 10 rooms. So the owner had rented out the rooms. Three of the rooms were rented by a single mother with her daughters. And after about 3 to 4 years, she actually purchased these three rooms. And when she did purchase the three rooms, she wanted a separate access into her side of the cluster. The only way to do it was, the toilet, which was on the side of the road, to convert the toilet to actually have the door where the toilet was. So they moved the toilet in the back of the house, and then this became the foyer. They have not heard about Marcel Duchamp's. They have not heard about the urinal, but they said, why waste good cement to fill this up? We're not using it. It's not harming us. It's there. So this hangs like a showpiece at in their foyer. Why am I using this story? This story talks about how tenure, this idea of who holds the land, who holds the houses, who holds tenure rights in what capacity. This is so varied that, and this is not really talked about in the way that we talk about tenure. Because tenure largely is talked from a state perspective, whether it's legal or illegal. And this is actually a de facto set of tenure rights where you might buy a house that is like two, you can build, but only with metal sheets, or you can get a plot of land, but you can't go 2 stories. So all these differentiations of how much you can build, and all of that is constantly negotiated, and also things are constantly traded. So bits, you could be having one room getting into 4 and then selling 2 of them. All of these fluctuations really is constantly happening under the surface, where it looks very homogeneous and sort of like held by a few people, because that's actually much more convenient to believe, and it's much more reductive. No other story really talks about this more than the house, the land held by Musharraf. So I track one particular guy, and I show this as an example. You can see pretty much he had 1 or 2 rooms, and then he started really having a lot of political capital. He used that to expand the land he was holding. By 2011, he held large swaths of land. He converted them to rickshaw garages and housing. In 2012, he consolidates, he builds. In 2013, at the end of 2012, he is killed. His mom, who takes over sort of this large land holding enterprise, is not able to sort of negotiate so much, and does not have the capital, the social capital, to hold on to this anymore. So slowly, uh, yes, 2 more minutes. It's another conclusion, and then you can see that. So it's like this is receding. So there is this notion of the flux of the tenure. Um, yes. So in conclusion, let me quickly go through the conclusion. Um, the way that the book is set up, I have my own conclusions at the end. If you read the 11 stories and you have different conclusions, you're free to, uh, you know, have it. So the book is designed in that way that you can go in through at any chapter and then read that and not really read the conclusion. But if you were to read the conclusion, the way that I see it is, I see instead of the self-organized, instead of the bottom up, I see very particular distinction between the 3 different levels of organization. At one level of organization, I see this is very quickly, yellow is old, red is new. So it's like a time lapse. So you can see what was built fresh versus what was there. The oldest parts of Karail, you can see sort of like this very haphazard way that things were brought together. And this is particularly because at that time, when the first residents moved in, they only had the desire to survive for 1 month. They were actually moving in from the formal neighborhood where they couldn't afford the rent anymore. They said, we're going to go and build a shed for 1 month, and then when we have enough money, we're going to move back. And that never happened. But the way that the form gets organized, the urban form, is particularly where it's not with a desire to stay long. So therefore, the coordination is not that much. As people start living there, they start to realize that no, this is it. This is the place. And so they start getting into this solidarity networks. They form these communal groups. So at one point they become collectivized, and then you can see where the housing were actually done in a collectivized way. So in one part of Korea, so for example here, in this stretch of land along the water, there were 35 of them coming together and saying, okay, we're going to do like terrace housing, so we're going to get all equal piece of land, and then they distribute within themselves in an egalitarian way, and then they build. And of course, then one person buys the next one, and then maybe someone has a bit more now, but it started in a very egalitarian way, with the 6 arms for each person. And then on the northern side, you can see a completely different mode of organization, and that's what I call a syndicated form, where for the first time in Coral, people who are not residents there are able to buy and move in, because some of the local leaders, what they did is actually they went to a full-fledged capitalist model. They took over the lake. They built apartments and sold it. So compared to the previous two ways, this is a completely different way where the primary desire to build was making profit. They were not really concerned about anything else other than to make profit out of this. So even within 500 meters by 500 meters, you see this minimum at least three levels in which the desires are completely different. I'll not go into the detail, but I mentioned some of this, this way that, how the urban production is constrained and how it's enabled. You can see that it's not so easy to say it's all entrapment. There are emancipatory actions taken by the court, civil society actors, help with mass movements. So of course, it sits at those two spectrums. In terms of much milder forms of oppositions, I talked about the story of the wall, where it's not about eviction, but just, causing inconveniences. So it can fall somewhat in between, minor oppositions and minor alignments. For example, recycling industry thriving there because of all the stuff that they get from the formal neighborhoods. So that sort of alignments which allow a neighborhood to, thrive. So it's like this full spectrum of it. But as a last ending point, in the conclusion, I talk about, and this is a sort of a reflection going back all the 17 years, beyond this how can we understand the everyday affirmation, sustaining the urban production, despite this overarching, set of entrapments. And particularly this is a reflection about the housing justice movement that's been going on in Bangladesh for the last 30 years, which stands at an impasse. It does not seem to move beyond the idea of all we can do for them is get an injunction from the court so that they're not evicted, which actually means that people are not able to sort of really, think of the settlement in their own terms. But for the housing justice activists that we worked with, lawyers, for them this seems to be like the highest form of housing justice they can talk about. So, the way that I end the book is this reflection on uh, a local sort of indigenous way that the people there often talk to themselves, that often talk about the way that they live in an everyday life. And this to me is sort of like answering this notion of the like moving beyond, and bringing different terms from local ontologies to sort of like destabilize the particular way we use. For example, now we talk a lot about cities of care with, so this is my way of destabilizing that and bringing something in. What I propose in the book is this concept of ihsan. So this concept of ihsan for me is a more than justice framework, because it talks about that everyday care and everyday set of relationalities, which oftentimes is not based on an obligation or transaction. I have nothing better than to share a story, and this is the last slide. The story of a boy who is actually in a gets into playing in the street. A rickshaw runs over his leg. His mom and dad are garments workers. They're in the factory, and then of course the ambulance is not going to come here. uh, there is this spontaneous sort of crowdsourcing that happens. All the shop owners who line that street, they start pulling in money. They take and one of them volunteers to take the kid to the hospital using that pooled money, pays, gets him wrapped up in a plaster, brings him home, puts him in bed, and then mom and dad come home to find their kid there, in the bed. These sort of momentary acts of kindness and momentary acts of all of this in Bangla, we use the term in this way where it has been slightly colloquialized in a way of saying, can you do some ahsan to me, like can you make it easy for me, can you show some grace? For example, you run out of salt, you don't have to pay money. or and then you borrow some salt, they actually never return. And again, every day, absolutely mundane forms of care. For me, I end in that note because for me, despite everything that happens at a state level, the injustice and all of that, the anxiety of not knowing whether your house is going to be there, all of that finds sort of a somewhat of a relief in knowing that you live in a place where the primordial condition is that people show a lot of ihsan to each other. So for me, that's a conceptual, and this is something that we're now exploring. I'm writing a conceptual paper on climate justice and ihsan, and this is being explored at this point. So this is really not there yet, but this is where the book ends. So again, this is the ending of the lecture. This is an unfinished book. As a biographer, I feel right now I'm also doing a grant-based work there. So my engagement has continued, and hopefully this will continue, and then I hope to be back in Melbourne with another book 20 years later. So thank you so much. Okay.
Are we allowed to continue for 10 minutes or what's the protocol here?
If people are open to another 10 minutes, knowing that it is the end of a long week, if you have to leave, I think that's fine. But if you're willing, 10 minutes? Yeah.
So we've got 3 questions, one of which I just asked because there weren't any showing up, but then we've got some real ones here. Mine is, of course, also real, but I'll put others first. So Patrick, do you want to? Is Patrick still?
Patrick is on Zoom.
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, you're up there. Okay.
Yeah.
Do you want to just present your question?
Okay. Thank you so much, Tanzil, for this fascinating presentation and for doing this very important piece of research. I'm just curious to know how your experience with this case study and also through this research particularly, and also based on your own lived experience in the context of Dakar, has informed or altered your understanding or thinking on informality. How do you want researchers, especially from the global north, approach informal settlements in the global south?
It's interesting you mentioned that because the book has a section on in the annex there is a section on the methods, and then actually reflecting on the way of knowing. Primarily, if you think of researchers as people who want to know and you want to produce knowledge, based on the reflections of my engagement there, I would point to a paper that I wrote where I make the argument. I shared the link in the chat, which is called Dirty Research. This idea that knowledge production is not really without entanglements, where you end up inevitably also shaping the very place that you are there to study. So I think that becoming aware of your own positionality is absolutely crucial when you're engaging with places like this, because oftentimes researchers they come in and then they leave, but they don't really understand how they are sort of also played in that game. How suddenly some community leaders taking a picture with Kim, for example, when Kim was there, and then how they use that in their narrative in a good or in a bad way. And just becoming more attuned to those entanglements is I think much needed. In terms of how this has informed, affected my understanding of informality, I mean, this is obviously, of course, a large part of how I look at informality. But just going back to something that David mentioned, when I stayed in Arkansas for 2.5 years, in a very sort of like marginalized, communities in redneck Trump state in Arkansas, there are sort of tonal familiarities. So it's not the material, like not a morphological familiarity, but there are lots of things that the reason that I say that is because I'm sort of keen not to talk about global south and north as forms of geographies where it's so distinct and the north goes to south, which is why I want to sort of mix all that up, because some forms of informality that I saw in Coral, I saw in these rural towns where people were doing a lot of these informal things. For example, coming up with their own farmers market that didn't get that were not legal and held in car parks and stuff like that. So again, I think all cities have this mix of formality and informality, and I've been sort of like learning from all, and not shaped just by Coral. I don't know if that's answering your question, but yeah, I have been up for a long time, so I know I'm also very groggy.
And is Amanda still with us?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. This is just a comment, Tanzil, but of course, congratulations for the book. It's fantastic. And I hope it also can be shared with all of our PhD students thinking about publishing the other side of their thesis. And we all have that other side of our thesis. I just kind of wanting to share my appreciation of the Holy Cow chapter. I think that sort of takes me to this similar situation in central of Jakarta. I think Kim probably remember that kampung where at the heart of the kampung is a tofu factory and a dormitory of the workers, pretty much installed behind a food stall that sell this fried tofu, fried tempeh. And the soy was actually imported from the US, and it supply fresh tofu and tempeh to local supermarket chain across central Jakarta, the capital of Jakarta, Indonesia, or at the moment still the capital of Indonesia. So I just want to share that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad. I mean, these are the resonances that this is what I want, resonances instead of theorizing, which is why the book doesn't theorize that, these synergies are everywhere. I describe my sets of synergies where you can, but if you relate, yes, that's precisely the point.
So just one more I've got here. And that is, I was curious about your description between the kind of arrangement between the NGO lenders and the dweller borrowers. And obviously this is a systemic thing and both sides know exactly what's going on. And I'm assuming that the NGO lenders get their money way back from somewhere, maybe in Europe or United States, and it comes with strings attached. But I'm still fascinated by the fact that at the ground level, to make this work, they both have to kind of just turn a blind eye to what's really going on and create this fictional story about what's going on. And why the formal system never adapts. It seems capable of adapting to what's actually needed and what's actually going on.
Absolutely. I mean, you hit that's absolutely the perfect spot to actually talk about. Now, just for context, right now I'm working with the new mayor of Dhaka in some capacity. So I'm able to sort of like look and have an insider, you know, uh, knowledge about sort of like this governance regimes, and particularly, it's astounding the level of uh, so the inertia. So if you were to sort of grant these loans, because this is baked in the law of private property, and this idea that loans, and it's impossible to sort of make this formalized, because the formalization is a network. You can't just formalize that bit. For that you have to change the land law. For the land law is coming from the British settlement of 1793, the permanent settlement that happened in 1793, and then the first time that land law was enacted. So imagine it's like a stack of dominoes. No one has the political will to formalize, to actually take on this mammoth task of all this intricate set of, this regime. It's much easier if you do it this way. It's much easier if make it like a drama, everything on paper, is fine, as opposed to actually, adapting would mean a tremendous amount of energy and resource needed to sort of, move all these different bits. This is my understanding, and it's this is just a spontaneous reflection. But I can see that even just doing even the changing the smallest thing right now in Dhaka, even for the mayor itself is so difficult, because everywhere it's bound by the law, and then for the law to change, it's incredibly difficult. unless there is political will. So yes, new laws have been enacted, but like for example, to build a 10 billion pound, highway in the city, they modified some law because there's incredible, political will to have this large scale infrastructure project for obvious reasons. But then there is not enough political will to really do things at that level. So this is my reflection at this point. Maybe it will change.
If I can just, do you want another question? No, I just wanted to say that this, to me, what you just said reminds me actually going back to Arkansas and Trump. It seems to be related to what's happening in the United States, because one way of looking at what's happening is that the systems and the law have become so entrenched. That's why they talk about the deep state, that nobody can actually get what they want anymore. So they hire a wrecker who's there just to kind of bulldoze the joint, so to speak.
No,
All right.
I mean, I can relate with that. Yes. I think this is the danger of, having this entrenchment for so long. You open the door for, the wrecker ball to come, but with its own intention. But I saw in Arkansas why Trump was so, popular, because it seemed like he would open doors, break laws and rules and all these regulations that does not allow a lot of this informality to happen. And in a more regulated state, country like the US, with more regulations that are enforced, it's much more difficult to be informal and get away compared to Bangladesh. So of course, it's that allowance for informality, that N+1, that is never given. People sort of like take it in one way or another. At least they try to, and then they get manipulated into other things.
Thanks, Tanzil.
Yeah.
We're up against time, and thanks very
Yes.
much. Great seeing you again, and you
No,
should
great
come
to
out to
be
Melbourne
back.
sometime and talk directly.
Yes. Looking forward to that. Thank you so
All right.
much for having me.
Thank
All
you.
right. Bye, guys. Thank you.